Well, Martin, thank you for your welcome, and thank you for having me to the Carey conference. I've heard of it many times over the years, but this is my first time to be at this conference, and it's good to be with you and sharing with you. And as Martin has said, we're involved in mission, both locally and globally. SIM, Serving in Mission, it stands for. Some of you know it under an older name. Which was? Sudan Interior Mission, yes. Many of those who've known it as Sudan Interior Mission never knew that when SIM first became Sudan Interior Mission, the country that we now call Sudan didn't exist. So that's really confusing, isn't it? So where was Sudan? Well, the first SIM missionaries went up through Lagos into northern Nigeria to what was then called the Sudan, which we now call the Sahel, that strip at the bottom of the Sahara. And that was SIM's heartland for many years. And then through a series of acquisitions and mergers, mission happens like that, SIM finds itself working today in 40 countries or so in Latin America and Asia and Africa, both above the equator and below the equator as well, including Southern Africa, where I know there are many folk here who have interest as well. So that's the global stuff, and then the local stuff. Just the last 2 years we've been involved in church planting, a small group of about 14 of us. And yesterday, Ray was so helpful because we've grown to about 40, 50 gathering. And we've realised that you can plant a church without having any full-timers, but you can't sustain the growth of a church without having full-timers. So we're at that point where we're having to think, what do we do now if the church is going to continue to grow? And so we're just wondering where the Lord would take us and what kind of additional help we should be drawing in alongside of us. So that's where we are. And Ray, thank you very much for yesterday morning. The stimulation about thinking about what kind of people does it take to grow a church on to the next stage. Certainly it takes people who've got more time than a full-time mission director and a full-time independent financial advisor have, as the two of us who've taken the lion's share of leadership find ourselves in those circumstances. Well, let me get on to the subject, because otherwise there won't be time for questions. I've been asked to speak about the challenges of mission, and particularly to pick up some of the themes that were coming out of the third Lausanne conference on world evangelization held in Cape Town just a few months ago now. I want to set that conference in some historical context before we come to what some of those challenges look like, because we need to see where we are in history in order to gain some sense of what the future challenges in mission might be. So let me just take us back to Edinburgh in 1910 and that great missionary conference, which had about 1,200 participants, predominantly North American and Northern European. And the great slogan of the day was the evangelization of the world in this generation. It was a time of great hope, and there was an ecumenical spirit abroad. The mission agencies that came together for that conference, or missionaries that came together for that conference, and church leaders were predominantly from the major denominations, and the major denominations had very significant mission arms, mission boards, and so on. And so there was growing out of what was going on around that time, and not least out of that conference, that there was a coming together of churches in mission that issued in what we now know as the World Council of Churches, and so on. Some of that history will be well enough known to us. And there was also a hopeful spirit about the future of the world in 1910, because we hadn't yet got to 1914. I mean, the mere maths tells us that, but you know what I mean. The world hadn't exploded. So it's not surprising that mission leaders might have been saying, within that context of a hopeful spirit and a coming together for mission, perhaps we can do it in our generation. Well, we have the benefit of hindsight. And so we fast forward to Cape Town and 2010, and people are still asking, how do we go about the task of mission? What is it that we should be doing? A rather bigger gathering, 4,200 participants from 198 countries. It would have been 199 if the Chinese government had allowed their delegation to leave the country. And you'll have probably seen the press reports around that, very, very sadly indeed, because we would have loved to have seen a large number from China coming to the conference. Very, very sadly indeed, the Chinese delegation was not able to be there. It was the third Lausanne Congress on world evangelization, and the first is perhaps the best known because of the Lausanne Covenant that flowed out of that, significantly drafted by John Stott, and that first Lausanne Congress being driven by the involvement, the sponsorship, the encouragement of Dr. Billy Graham. And those two great leaders really drew together a group of evangelicals that hadn't been seen before. Well, this is the third. One of the questions is, will there be a fourth? Now, I'm not a prophet nor son of a prophet, and if I were, I wouldn't admit it with Bill here. So I'm not going to attempt to answer that question. But the Congress did reassert a significant number of evangelical essentials. Os Guinness's address on truth was outstanding. There was consistently from the preaching from the book of Ephesians a focus on Christ and the cross and the resurrection. There was a focus on the uniqueness of Christ. Lindsay Brown came back to that right at the end of the conference. There was consistent focus on the need for us to be taking the gospel out into all the world, and so on. So those great essentials were there and were reaffirmed, and it was good to hear. There was also a recognition of change. We live in a rapidly changing world. Some of us don't like change, some of us love change. I'm one of those people who quite likes change and like creating space for change and all of that. Some of us don't like change. Whatever our preferences are, the problem is that change is here to stay. That's the unchanging thing, change. And we've got to be able to grapple with that. And we'll come to some of the issues of change that are there in the world for us to address. I think there were three major challenges, and here we come to the heart of what I'm needing to say in this session. I think there were three major challenges that were evident in Cape Town. I'm calling them these. What is the church's mission and the ongoing debate around that? To whom is the church's mission to be directed? Where should be the focus? What are the priorities for our generation? And the last question is this: from where will the church's mission be driven? And there are some issues of change around that question. So those are the three things that I want us to look at this morning. What is the church's mission? Well, let's look back to the aftermath of Edinburgh. The ecumenical movement grows, and at the same time, as we were being reminded last evening by Bruce, liberalism drives the social gospel movement. Evangelicals react. Bruce was reminding us about that in relation to the Christology. Evangelicals react. Rightly so. We have no choice. Something has to be said. But of course there's the danger of overreaction, isn't there? And what happened in the early years of, and the middle years of the last century is that in many places evangelicals withdrew from social engagement. It was perhaps more marked in North America, and certainly when you look at the history of interdenominational missions like our own, some of the struggles and battles that go on are sharper in North America than they are here in Europe. But nonetheless, both in North America and in Northern Europe, there is a response to social engagement, which in some places becomes pretty near social withdrawal. Incidentally, it's been really heartening being here at this conference and hearing a number of people talking about church life in which there is social engagement. Of course, absolutely centrally proclamation of the gospel, but it's great to be in a group where people are seeking to hold together that which God would have us to hold together. So I've been really encouraged. But there was, during that period, something of an evangelical narrowing. And then the First Lausanne Congress, you remember, produced that magisterial Lausanne Covenant. And if you've never read it, you really should. It's on the web. It's widely available. And you remember how in that, John Stott and the others who worked with him sought to establish the priority of proclamation evangelism and the necessity of engaging with society around. And there was in that sense something of a correction to the swing of the pendulum. Pendulums always swing, don't they? Pendula, sorry. Always swing. Oliver Barclay, who one of the significant leaders of student ministry in this country, often used to speak of the biblical perpendicular. When students swung in one direction, he would often say, don't be too anxious about it. If they're God's people, they will be drawn back by the force of biblical gravity towards the biblical perpendicular. There's some truth in that, isn't there? But pendulums do swing. But for all that the Lausanne Covenant helped us enormously in this area, there has been ongoing debate around this question of what is the church's mission. Both sides of the Atlantic. That continues. And books have continued to be written, like Tim Chester's Good News to the Poor, which I commend to you. And why did Tim have to write this book? Was it because the Lausanne Covenant hadn't been written, or that people weren't reading it? Well, no, but because there was an ongoing debate. There were struggles. It actually has this very, very interesting section right at the beginning of the book, where he imagines four people coming from different places that touch on evangelicalism. There's a kind of post-evangelical, and there's someone who's a very strong Tier Fund supporter, and someone else, I mean, he doesn't quite use this language, but someone else who goes to all the Proclamation Trust conferences, and someone who's a sort of reformed separatist in the, I don't mean it in the ecclesiological sense, I mean it in the sense of separated from society kind of separatist. And he says, look here, he says, these people, they find themselves struggling with each other and interacting with each other, and the gospel proclaimer mistakes the Tier Fund supporter for the post-evangelical. And do you see, we experience some of that, don't we? And so he has to write a book to help us get our heads around how we hold together the various elements of the church's mission. And it's a very good book. But it simply illustrates that there's an ongoing debate. And I suspect we face the tension in our churches. Well, if you don't, praise the Lord. Certainly if you're involved in student ministry or other kinds of mission engagements, one is constantly aware of some of these challenges of defining what is it we're about. Well, that's the retrospect. So where do we come to at this moment? Present and prospect. Do download the Cape Town Commitment. It's available on the web, on the Cape Town website. Let me just see if I can flick to that website. There's John Piper speaking on his passage in Ephesians that he was allotted. Let's just run up so that you can see the top of the website of the Lausanne movement, Cape Town 2010. And you'll be able to find the Cape Town Commitment on that website. It's worth a read. The principal architect, drafter of that document is Chris Wright, and with his carefulness and his solid rooting in Old Testament and New Testament missiology, Chris has done an excellent job for us. The commitment reaffirms the principal thrust of the Lausanne Covenant, that mission involves an engagement of the whole church with the whole human predicament. And it responds to the majority world church's appeal to us in the West not to dichotomize by using the language of integral mission. And it would be helpful if you want to explore what that language means to pick up that document and read it. The Cape Town Commitment, perhaps as one of the significant new features over and above the Lausanne Covenant, is that it recognises that ecological matters can't be ignored in any Christian analysis of the issues that we face today. And may I just say, that's not just a Western preoccupation. If you come from Bangladesh, you worry about sea level rises. So wherever you touch around the world, Christians are talking about this issue and recognizing that there is a huge challenge ahead if the predictions are right. Well, if they aren't, then praise the Lord. But if they are, there are some huge challenges for brothers and sisters in some parts of the world. I sat at a table with a lady from a South Sea island. She was the only delegate from her country, because the population of her country is only 11,000. Not the Christian population, you understand, the population. So she was the only delegate, but will her country be there? There are folk who face these kinds of questions, and we need to be alert to that as an issue of change. What about the discussion at Cape Town? Well, why is that thing going round and round there? There we go. What about the discussion at Cape Town? Well, the discussion at Cape Town certainly reflected the ongoing tension that I've already spoken of in terms of how we understand the nature of mission. And John Piper brought us to that in his exposition. Now, I don't know whether you're going to be able to see this very well on the screen. Is it visible from the back? Because you might find this helpful. John, speaking on this issue of the tension, said this. He spoke of two truths. He says, look, one truth is that when the gospel takes root in our souls, I wish I could do it the way he would do it. I feel tempted to get Bruce to come up here and read this. One truth is that when the gospel takes root in our souls, it impels us outwards towards the alleviation of all unjust suffering in this age. That's what love does. The other truth is that when the gospel takes root in our souls, it awakens us to the horrible reality of eternal suffering in hell, under the wrath of a just and omnipotent God. And it impels us to rescue the perishing and to warn people to flee from the wrath to come, citing 1 Thessalonians. I plead with you, don't choose between these two truths. Embrace them both. Could Lausanne say, we Christians care about all suffering, especially eternal suffering? I hope we can say that. But if we feel resistant to saying especially eternal suffering, or if we feel resistant to saying we care about all suffering in this age, then either we have a defective view of hell or a defective heart. You see his experimental Calvinism coming in. I pray that Lausanne would have neither. Now that's powerful, isn't it? It's very powerful. And I think there were numbers of us at the conference who found it exceedingly helpful. But the honest truth is that our brothers and sisters from the non-Western world don't see the issue as dichotomized like that in the first place. And there's a question that we're going to have to come back to a little later around that. For it has to do with how we may unwittingly project issues that are issues for us onto the rest of the world. As I say, we'll come back to that. What is the church's mission? The debate is ongoing, and we need to keep grappling with it. The second major area that I've suggested that we need to think about is this: to whom is the church's mission? There were three thrusts evident in Cape Town. And the first is that towards unreached people groups. Not surprising, Ralph Winter at the first Lausanne conference spoke to the issue of people groups and to reaching the unreached. And at Lausanne 3, Paul Eshelman presented a paper and then spoke. And if I can read you a little bit from his paper. Throughout the world today, pastors, mission leaders, and lay people are working towards the day when every person on earth will have access to the gospel of Jesus Christ. There are movements to reach every people group, to finish the task of world evangelization, to complete the Great Commission, and to work toward the worship of our God by every people throughout the world. Various researchers, organizations, and confessions define these terms differently, but they all revolve around our Lord's command to make disciples of all nations. At the first Lausanne conference in 1974, Ralph Winter clarified for us that the scriptural references to nations actually refer to the ethne, or people groups. He and others began to speak of the idea of missiological closure among these people groups. It's an interesting echo from 1910, isn't it? The evangelization of the world in this generation, and Winter coming back to that issue of missiological closure. As leaders in the church, says Eshelman, we need to know where the command of the Great Commission is not being fulfilled. So there is this emphasis on the unfinished task and the priority of the unreached, which appears. But I think we need to ask some questions about that. And the first is this: who are the unreached? Well, I have to tell you that my neighbours are as yet unreached. They are, and it's a burden. But there is another kind of level of unreached, isn't there? Because my neighbours may as yet be unreached with the gospel, but Julia and I live next door to them. And there is another level of being unreached, because there are whole people groups, thousands, millions of people, who have no Christian neighbour, where there is no church, and where there is no mission towards them. So it's right to speak of whole groups of people without a witnessing church or missionary, and they are unreached in a different kind of way. And they present a proper challenge. But even accepting that it is legitimate, right, necessary, vital to speak of unreached people groups in that kind of way, and for us to take the challenge of those people groups absolutely seriously, I want to suggest that there are problems if we use that concept in some kind of mechanistic tick box way to define the mission of the church towards closure. Here's this list of people groups, and we tick them off. Uyghur, tick. Wolof, tick. Miao, tick. By the way, that's not just the sound a cat makes, that's a people group in China. There is a problem with that approach to defining the mission of the church. And I want to illustrate it in two ways, why there's a problem. And the first way is this: what about the places that were once reached? We've been reminded of some of these great North African guys of the early centuries. Well, how do you see North Africa today? Is it reached or unreached? Do you understand? If we just have this tick box mentality, tick them off, done, and then sometimes crassly, and then Jesus can come again. We've got a historical problem. But there's another level of a problem, and it's this: what does it mean to reach a people? You see, the call is for us to disciple the nations. And we have to ask some penetrating questions. How do we can a group be reached and yet undiscipled? Well, think about Rwanda. In 1994, early 1994, before the genocide, would we say that Rwanda was reached or unreached? Reached. By any definition of reached or unreached that people who talk about mission talk about, Rwanda was reached. But was it discipled? No. There'd been revival. Friends. But the people of Rwanda had missed out on key aspects of discipling, and so the place became a veritable hell. Now, we need to feel this. We need to understand that our task is not a sort of tick box, reached. It's the absolute vital. You know this in your own congregations, don't you? It's the vital work of discipling people, discipling communities. Or might even say discipling whole cultures. And to disciple a people, we know from that great commission passage from which Ralph Winter draws, quite properly drawing from there, but we know that the challenge there is to teach them to obey everything that I have commanded you. Isn't that right? And I'm still being discipled by Christ through his word, by the Spirit. So we have to ask some big questions about this concept of closure. Unless we are to end up with a reductionistic view of mission. Second major area that comes out of Lausanne, unreached people groups. It's been there from the first Lausanne conference and issued in movements like the AD 2000 movement, which had to be AD 2000 and beyond eventually, didn't it? And all of that, you know, that thought that we would pursue this task and make significant progress by AD 2000. That whole unreached people groups strategy is now being challenged additionally by the growth of the cities of our world. Urbanisation, about 15% urbanised in 1910 at the great missionary conference in Edinburgh. Over 50% of the world now urban. We went over the tipping point about 3 or 4 years ago. And this phenomenon presents huge challenges for us in mission. Certainly it does for a mission like SIM or for missions of our generation, whose ministry was predominantly to rural areas, and our models of ministry and the models of churches that we planted as well significantly rural in approach. And urban mission looks so different. I mean, to be honest, we ought to be more scared about this in SIM than we are. And I think we haven't quite fully woken up to this. And the challenges of doing mission in the urban environment, and in particular in some of these vast megacities around the world, are huge. And we have growing numbers of new unreached people groups in megacities. So the whole concept of how you define a people group has to be rethought for the generation that we live in. And I think we have to be grateful in our day for the leadership of folk like Tim Keller, who is doing groundbreaking thinking about what it means to do mission in the urban environment. Of course, a particular urban environment in New York. But Tim, we're grateful to him that he's driving us to think about reaching urban poor and urban rich. Missions of our generation, like SIMs, are often better at reaching the urban poor in some ways through deploying rural poor type ministries into the urban environment, but often not so good at reaching the movers and shakers in the urban environment. And Tim is provoking us all to think that through. And it picks up on some of the things that Ray was saying yesterday about the urban environment and larger churches and the need for aesthetic excellence and so on. And Tim Keller is rightly challenging us to think about matters like that. Engagement of music and arts and so on. So we need to be thinking about the cities. But then a third area of a third thrust is that towards post-Christendom Europe. And there is no doubt that our brothers and sisters in the global south are seeing mission towards Europe as a significant target. And one of the questions for us is, how do we respond to that? And that leads us on to this third area. From whom is the church's mission? From whom is the church's mission? The church of the global south has grown phenomenally. Praise the Lord. When you think of those who gave their lives to malaria and martyrdom, and you look at what God has done, your heart just has to rise, doesn't it? The growth of the church in Africa are not only in breadth but depth as well. I'm okay when African brothers and sisters talk about the church in Africa being a mile wide and an inch deep. I find it quite difficult when I hear us Westerners saying the same thing, because, to be honest, there can be quite a lot of shallowness here. And actually, well, I say this I joke with my African friends. I say, when Westerners say that, they don't know what an African river's like. If you try and walk across a big African river, or drive across, you know what it's like? It can be very shallow at the edges and for quite a long way. And then all of a sudden your Land Rover goes right under the water. Because you find a point of phenomenal depth. And it's often like that with the churches in Africa. Well, that's why our brothers and sisters have been able to produce the Africa Bible Commentary, edited by the late, great Tokumbo Adeyemo. Because there is depth in the continent. And there are voices whom we need to learn to hear in Africa and Asia and Latin America also. So we have growing numbers, growing strength, and growing confidence in the global south. Witness what's happening in the Anglican Communion with the global south leaders saying, we're the guys who are having to take leadership now. Sorry, Canterbury, but that's how it's going to have to be. Leadership is a charismatic function. You understand how I'm using the word. And God is raising up leaders, grace gifted for leadership. And they were there at Lausanne, and they spoke to groups of us and acknowledged their sense of God's call on their lives for this moment. So whilst there's that growth, there's also continued political power from the rich north that is part of the scene, the day that we live in. I've no doubt that money is a significant part of that, but I think there are also attitudinal questions for us to address. And so at Lausanne, one could sense tensions arising because of residual colonial, neo-colonial attitudes from the north and the west. We Brits tend to live with post-colonial angst, don't we? On the one hand, we can be infected by a kind of inbred superiority complex, and yet on the other hand, we can be paralysed by a sense of the wrong that we've done in the past. It's a challenge for us. Other parts of the world who are in different phases of colonialism will face different sorts of challenge. So there's that on our side, but there is also, I sense, and I'm sorry about this, but a growing impatience with the north and the west from those from the south and the east. It's a bit like that Elizabeth Gaskell novel, North and South. We're living in a story of passion and conflict, a story of poverty and wealth, a story of prejudice and love. The story of mission past is a story of mission from the north and the west to the south and the east. And God has blessed William Carey, Robert Morrison, Hudson Taylor, Adoniram Judson. I do not have time to tell about Henry Venn, C.T. Studd, Roland Bingham, Gladys Aylward, Amy Carmichael, who through faith conquered nations, administered justice. Sorry, I've slipped, haven't I? But, you know, and there is this panoply of heroes of the past. Humanly speaking, the vast churches of the East and global South are the fruit of the service of such as these, whose names we know, and hundreds, thousands of others whose names we don't know, who died young, whose children went to the grave very small, and so on. The church, the denomination that we work with in Nigeria, the Evangelical Church of West Africa, I think is numbering something over 5 million members now, thousands of congregations. And you just have to say, praise the Lord. But the story of mission present is a different one, because now the South has grown. And how will the story of mission be written in 200 years' time? Will it be a story of mission from the South and the East to the North and the West? Is that what we have to prepare for in our hearts and our attitudes? Will it be a story of the revitalization of the church in the West or of its collapse? Will it be a story of pride and prejudice and conflicts between the North and the South? I pray not, but rather a story of partnership and mutuality and service and learning to listen and learning to receive, as well as others learning who have received much learning to give, and so on. These are the days that we live in. There are these tensions. But there is a warning from the early church, and here I just come back for about 3 minutes to that passage that was read at the beginning. For you see, something happens in Acts 19 and at Ephesus. Up until this point in the story of the book of Acts, the church has been growing out of the Jewish context, with Jewish leaders, evangelists. The mission of the church has touched others who aren't Jews, but always starting in the synagogue, reaching Jews and proselytes and God-fearers. We get stories of all of those kinds of people. But in Acts 19, and you get this sort of mini-repeat Pentecost. In Acts 19, something fresh happens. Not totally new, it's been hinted towards, but it's fresh in measure because the gospel so starts to penetrate a pagan culture that people are burning their sorcery books and all the rest of it, and that culture itself starts to get anxious about this. The gospel is starting to transform a pagan culture now. It's broken out of its Jewish environments into the pagan world. Now, fast forward 100 years. How many Jewish leaders will there be in the church? Precious few. How will the work of the gospel amongst Jews be going? Well, you don't need me to tell you, do you? There is this hardening. Now move on to the time of Carey. And the gospel starts to break out of Christendom as we've known it. And fast forward 200-300 years, and old Christendom is spiritually shrinking. Where will we be in 200 years' time? I pray not where the church amongst the Jews ended up. And what were the seeds of that? Well, Jewish rejection of the gospel, or in our term, secularism. But are there not some indications in the New Testament about how Jewish Christians struggled to receive the outsiders? Now, can you see where I'm going? Brothers and sisters, we are very white. And we're probably quite middle class too. What would God's challenge for us in relation to mission be? How can we learn to listen and to receive? Granted that we're those who have spoken and given for so long. And at that point, I ought to shut up.